Shalom, everyone, and thank you for being here. In this last year, we have had to face a deep feeling of vulnerability. We always knew on an intellectual level that we are vulnerable, but for many of us, this is the first time that we really felt it. Some almost invisible virus has threatened our lives. And humankind, which has been able to send the man to the moon 50 years ago, who has developed so many new technologies in the last 20 years or so, was put to the test. And while we waited and still wait for prevention methods, we saw millions of people dying. In our second encounter of this weekend, I want to talk about how Judaism understands that vulnerability might not be a bad thing. In fact, that vulnerability and happiness go together. This seems quite counterintuitive, right? Because when we hear the word vulnerability, what comes to mind is weakness, lack of protection. If I'm vulnerable, I'm exposed, I'm unprotected. It's quite scary, even dreadful. Being invulnerable, on the other hand, elicits the feeling of absolute strength, of being indestructible. And yet, according to Judaism, the exact opposite is true. The true source for indestructible strength is actually vulnerability. Let's examine this carefully. One thinks of a vulnerable person as somebody who is completely exposed, defenseless, and can be hurt. Now, that's true. And a newborn child, for example, is a prototype of that, right? The baby is exposed, the baby is defenseless, the baby can be hurt. And yet, there's a level of beauty to that stage. None of us would ever want to give up on those years of a young child's vulnerability. The vulnerability of our very human nature. Is that a negative? Would we really want to be supermen, superwomen that are impossible to be hurt? Would we really want to be so protected? Yes, there are those of us that have been hurt in life, and because of that have developed a defense mechanism, a heavy armor that we put around us and wear all the time. And yet, let's be very honest. If we have an armor on, have we really become invulnerable? Or is the armor itself a sign that we are so vulnerable that we have no choice but to put up all of these defense mechanisms? You know, science teaches us that the porcupine, which has all those sharp needles, has one of the softest, if not the softest, underbellies. The needles are there exactly to protect that underbelly because it is so tender and so fragile. Many times when we see people's spikes, when we see how tough they are, if we take the time to look deeply and carefully, we might notice that there is a very gentle soul, which is simply trying to protect itself so as to not open doors for vulnerability. It may certainly make them feel invulnerable, especially if nobody can really pierce that armor. But think about it. Someone who is protected in such a way, can they ever have a true, trusting relationship? The very nature of a relationship, especially love, whether it is love of a spouse, a friend, or even love of God, means that in some ways, we're vulnerable. And don't we all want to have healthy relationships of love and trust? Isn't it worth giving up on being invulnerable to have these deep, profound, meaningful relationships? Let me give you a second element to consider. We read in the Talmud, by the way, in the same tractate and chapter where we find the stories that I shared last night, the following. One should always be as flexible as a reed and not as unyielding as a cedar. This is why the reed merited to have been chosen to be made from it a quill to write a Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzot. Using a very simple example from nature, the Talmud is begging us to ask ourselves, which is more likely to withstand a very powerful storm? A reed that is flexible, that is soft, that is seemingly vulnerable and yields, or the tree that is strong, that is firm, that is rigid, that is unwavering? And initially, many would say, you need to be strong to survive a storm. The firm, the rigid, is much more likely to survive, but it's not true. It's the reed, precisely because of its vulnerability and its flexibility, that yields as the wind blows. It doesn't fight the wind. And because it allows itself to blow from one side to another, it can actually then come back when the wind stops. A tree or any other rigid, firm item, which seems to be invulnerable, actually can withstand some winds. But when the winds get stronger, it won't survive. All that resistance will only lead to the tree falling. Vulnerability, therefore, is something to be celebrated, not dreaded. It is the reed, the flexible, the vulnerable reed that is chosen to be the instrument with which one is going to write a Sefer Torah or mezuzot and tefillin. The key to being minimally indestructible and protected is not invulnerability, not having superhuman strength. People who are truly indestructible surrender to the fact they are not in control of everything. That's what the reed says. I'm not in control. The winds are blowing. Let them blow. I'm just going to go with the wind. That's what a good swimmer does. That's what a good surfer does. The key to real indestructibility in life is not being afraid of the wind, knowing that you are able to adapt to the circumstances. Being at peace with your own vulnerability allows you to know that even before the storm strikes, or in our case, even before life traumas present themselves, you will be able to navigate life with all the beauty and the happiness that it offers, even if there will be moments of storms. Judaism actually has a holiday in which we celebrate vulnerability, and that's Sukkot. We leave the solid, strong houses that we live in, and we move to unstable, vulnerable booths. Vulnerability is the essence of the holiday of Sukkot. We're not asked to do that all year round. We're only asked to do that for a week every year. Now, when you attend a retreat, not in a 5-star hotel, not even in a 1-star hotel, but out in the woods or camping grounds, the very vulnerability of the situation is more than just refreshing. It completely reveals a whole different dimension that otherwise you would never know about. There's something about walls, concrete walls, man-made structures that tend to conceal or at least repress some of our truer selves. In a tent, sometimes it rains, sometimes it's very uncomfortable, but those are the memories that are unforgettable. You don't forget these moments, not just because it was uncomfortable. It's not the discomfort that remains with us. It's the openness, it's the honesty, it's the naked truth without any structures. This pandemic has exposed just that. So many of us, if not all, were so reliant on those rigid and determined and planned structures. The structure of our schedules, our work, entertainment, summer plans, things which offered us routine and a sense of security. And yet, almost overnight, a year ago, it was all taken away, as if we were moving from a solid house to a very, very shaky outdoor structure. It was almost as if we were being asked suddenly to spend a full year living in this symbolic sukkah. Yet, we can't forget that the holiday of Sukkot, the holiday that celebrates vulnerability, is actually also called Zman Simchatenu, the time of happiness, of joy, clearly indicating that for Judaism, somehow vulnerability and happiness go hand in hand. How can that be? If I leave the comfort of my warm, modern, spacious home and sit in a small, impermanent hut that is exposed to all of the elements, how can I be happy? If I leave my normal life and I'm obligated to live with absolutely no certainty, with fear of a virus, giving up all that is structured, where on earth can I find joy in that? Why does the Torah in Deuteronomy affirm that on Sukkot we shall have nothing but joy? Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, one of the great Hasidic rabbis, spoke a lot about simcha, about happiness, especially because for him, as for many Hasidic thinkers, joy was the way to deeply connect to the divine. And he wrote, "It is a great mitzvah to always be happy and to make every effort to determinedly keep depression and gloom at bay." An analogy: sometimes when people are happy and dance, they grab someone standing outside of the circle who is depressed and gloomy. Against his will, they bring him into the circle of dancers. Against his will, they force him to be happy along with them. It is the same with happiness. When a person is happy, gloom and suffering stand aside. Yet greater still is to gather courage to actually pursue gloom and to introduce it into the joy, such that the gloom itself turns into joy. A person should transform gloom and all suffering into joy. It is like a person who comes to a celebration. The abundant joy and happiness then transforms all his worries, depression, and gloom into joy. We find that he has grabbed the gloom and introduced it against its will into the joy, as in the aforementioned analogy. And so when I read this, it takes me back to that story, the last story that we read last night, about the jesters, the ones who make people laugh, who somehow manage to give them a little bit of happiness, pushing away the depression, the gloom. Those are the ones who have a place in the world to come. Reb Nachman is not saying anything that is that different from that. What he's saying is we need to bring joy to people, because joy actually not makes us only connect better to God, which is his belief, as is the Hasidic belief in general, but it will help us connect to each other. It will help us be able to stand on our feet and go through life even when times are difficult. This last year has allowed us all to rethink our priorities and to put things in perspective. It is exactly because we are so vulnerable that we are able to focus now on what is really important. Having to scale back has driven us to find the little, and maybe not so little, joys of life. Being so vulnerable has taught us to appreciate things that we took for granted. Our families, our children, our grandchildren, our parents, our neighbors, our rabbis, our communities. All of this has become so much more important for us right now. And it's exactly because we are vulnerable that these relationships are being strengthened. A coronavirus story that took place in Italy right at the beginning of the pandemic summarizes this story in a very good way. A 93-year-old man was stricken with COVID-19, and in spite of his age, after spending many days in the hospital, he survived. Upon being discharged from the hospital, he was presented with a very large bill. Part of it was for payment for the ventilator, which he had been put on for one day. Reading the amount that was due, The old man started crying. The hospital felt a sense of compassion and told him, "Sir, don't worry. Surely we can work something out with you. We'll reduce the cost. We'll make sure that something more manageable can be presented to you. Please don't worry." And the old man responded. And his response made the hospital workers actually start to cry. The old man explained, "I'm not crying because of the money I have to pay you. Thankfully, I'm able to afford it. I cry for another reason. I cry because I've just come to realize after all these many years on earth, I've been breathing God's air for 93 years. Yet, I have never had to pay for it. It seems it takes over this huge bill of a ventilator in the hospital for one day for me to notice the air that I have been breathing for all these years. Do you know how much I owe God? Why haven't I ever truly thanked him all the days of my life for the miracle of this divine gift, which I simply took for granted?" This story was all over the internet when it happened. And it might be a little, made nicer by whoever is telling the story. But the point remains. The point remains that it is only in times of vulnerability that we are able to appreciate what we have had and never really thought about it. I always thought, if I want to travel, I travel. I have a child living across the world, but what's the big deal? If I can afford the ticket, I'll just hop on a plane and go visit my daughter. And I learned in this past year that that's not the way it is. I can't just go on a plane. But I took the ability to travel whenever I want to for granted. Now, when life goes back to normal, which it will, God willing, at some point, I'm going to really appreciate this much more. We all are. Going out for dinner with friends is going to be a big thing. We're going to think about it. Wow, I'm so thankful I can go out for dinner with my friends, which for a whole year we have not been able to do. As I mentioned last night, each and every one of us can not only make an effort to be happy, not only make sure that we appreciate the gifts that we have, but we can also reach out to those who might be in a gloomy state of mind and bring them some joy. We are in the month of Adar. We have to increase in happiness. It is actually a commandment. The truth is that it's not just because we are commanded to do so. It's because really, if we look to this past year deeply, we will find out that vulnerability, as bad as it seemed, as difficult as it is, as terrible as it might have felt in the beginning, has actually brought us to a point where happiness is more prevalent because we are now happier with smaller things than before. We don't need that much to be happy today. I think this is a Jewish message, not just of Sukkot, but of Judaism in general, that we have the ability to be happy in the middle of crises, that we can always choose what we want to focus on. Do we want to focus on the difficulties? Do we want to focus on the vulnerability? Or do we want to focus on the happiness that can come from the vulnerability? Do I want to focus on the big things that I can't do? Or should I look at the small things that I can do and that bring me so much pleasure and say, wow, I have this. It's not ideal. It's not looking at the world with rose-colored glasses. It's not pretending that nothing is happening. It's learning how to be happy in spite of what is happening. And so I urge you to celebrate our collective and our personal vulnerability by focusing on what we are able to do, on what we were able to learn in the last many months, which is to find ways to be happy and to be grateful for all that we do have. And it's important that we learn from this and extend our hand and smile to those who are not yet there, those who are not able to see the good, which is so many times hidden behind a veil. It's true, a lot of people have suffered. A lot of people have suffered loss in the last year. A lot of us have lost jobs, have lost loved ones, have lost happiness. But the truth is that happiness will come from being vulnerable, from being flexible, from being able to be brought into the circle of dance to push away the gloom. I urge you to remember that happiness comes from within and that we have the power, just like the jesters, to bring it to somebody else. Happiness does not diminish when it is shared. On the contrary, the more we share happiness, the more it is multiplied. Shabbat Shalom. And please join me live tonight and tomorrow so that we can actually talk to each other. I very much look forward to seeing you all.